Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Hub Cures. I apologize for not being here in live video, but my internet's really bad here for some reason this week. But welcome again. We have a great lineup today with Jeff Karp and Jenny Rowe moderating Fireside Chat. Also want to sort of remind everyone that the MLSC conference on July 22nd, registration is now open. It's free, so please register. You'll also get a chance to use the Curious Reactor one-on-one matching service. And so the sooner you sort of register, the sooner as other people register, you'll get matched with other people that have a similar sort of interest and background as yourself. Again, the MLSC conference, it's virtual. It'll be free. Please come and join. It'll be on this same platform on Goldcast. And, we expect to, last year we got about 700 people registered, 500 plus people at the event. We probably will see something similar. And I think that's the only announcement. The only other announcement I would make is there is a poster session at MLSC, and we're accepting poster applications until June 15th. So somebody will post, a link to the poster application. So if you are a academic doing translational work, please submit a poster. It's pretty straightforward, the application process, and during MLSC, you'll get a chance to both do a 1-minute pitch of your poster, as well as your poster itself, have a table where people will come and see you virtually. And we're accepting posters, not just from Massachusetts institutions, but from anywhere. So for those of you people in New Jersey or Connecticut or other states, we had posters last year, even from far away as the Midwest. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jenny and to Jeff and have a great fireside chat.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is one of many Hub Cures that we hold. We hold Hub Cures every 2 weeks until MLSC Day, and we feature cool people from Massachusetts doing translational work and commercialization of their technology. So today we have Dr. Jeff Karp. Dr. Karp is a biomedical engineer, professor in Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital. He works in the field of regenerative medicine, drug delivery, and medical device, but he has been extremely productive in research, publishing over 125 peer-reviewed articles, but also very productive in entrepreneurial space. So he's a role model in being a serial entrepreneur, concurrent to his academic position. Jeff, I think you have 7 ventures already or more. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and his journey through it. So Jeff is a known figure. There's a lot of things written about him. Jeff has multiple TED Talks you can go and check out. So today I want to actually focus on a couple things that other stories online that you can find doesn't really talk about. And that is, I think it's really foundational to Jeff's success, and that is Jeff not taking failure as actually a failure, but using that as an opportunity for growth and a point of iteration. So there are a couple stories that I want to touch upon that Jeff and I went through before we got on stage to kind of give a little flavor on what his attitude toward it and philosophy behind it. So while I was preparing for it, I was Wikipediaing Jeff, and I found actually he also got a rejection from getting into Bob Langer's lab as a postdoc early on because there was a shortage in funding. And Jeff didn't take that as a no. He actually got his own funding from Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, and secured the funding and joined Langer Lab and continuing that legacy. So I think that really sets the tone of how he has been entrepreneurial like that from the beginning. So during our conversation, Jeff talked a little bit about the founding story of his first company, Skintifique. And that actually was led from a couple of the rejections that he got from national NIH's research funding, or some of these conventional research funding that he applied and got rejected, and eventually broadened his scope to some of the smaller tech award type, and received Mass Life Sciences Center's award that led to many great things. So Jeff, talk us a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, no, happy to. Actually, when I was applying to Bob's lab, I emailed him, and he basically said no. And I thought, okay, well, maybe I should just leave this and try to figure something else out. But I don't know, whatever. In that moment, I wrote him back and I said, well, if I got my own funding, would you accept me in your lab? And he wrote back immediately and said yes. And then again, I had another one of those moments, and I asked him, would you put that in writing? And so he put it in writing, and then I tacked it onto a fellowship application.
Oh, I think, Jeff, your volume is a little low.
Is it low? Okay, hold
yeah.
on. Let me check here. Hold on. Let's see if I turn this off and go.
Oh, we can't hear you. Nope. Nope. No. Uh-oh. Okay.
How about that?
Yeah, great.
Okay. Whoa, sorry about that. I didn't realize I needed to change my settings here, but okay.
No worries.
So basically, I was just saying that that when I was applying to Bob Langer's lab, he said no, and then I had this moment where I was like, okay, what do I do? Do I just kind of go on and figure something else out? And for whatever reason, I wrote back to him and I said, well, what if I got my own funding? And he wrote back to me immediately and said, well, then we could accept you. And I said, and again, I had another one of those moments, and I was like, well, what could you put that in writing? And then I tacked it onto a fellowship application that didn't even ask for, there was no place for references. And it was back in the day when there were like paper applications. So I put it on the back of that, I submitted it. And then I got the fellowship and I wrote to Bob and I was like, are you still will you accept me? So anyhow, that's the story of how I got into Bob's lab. There's actually a lot of other kind of components of that as well. But yeah, I think you were asking me about the my kind of early days, and actually, I encountered a lot of failure. In fact, I wrote my first 2.5 years. I wrote about 100 grants. Almost all were rejected. I had about 3 years of funding in my startup package, and I got to about the 2.5 year mark. And it wasn't looking very good. In fact, my wife said, "Are you sure this is the right career for you?" So it was kind of one of those situations. And what happened is that I was just really maybe like too ambitious, in the sense of like people told me I needed to include preliminary data, and I was kind of resisting that because I wanted to just do all sorts of new things I'd never worked on before. And sure enough, that was kind of the major criticism. But then over the years, I generated preliminary data. But then what happened was I'll never forget this, because this is when my daughter was born, and I had submitted this Mass Life Science grant for like $50,000 or something like that, which actually is a significant amount of money for me at the time, because I really didn't have much funding. And I got to the next stage, and I went to give a presentation, and I like stopped in the middle. It was like horrendous because I was so tired, because Jordan, my daughter, had just been born. And I was certain that I wouldn't get the funding. And then someone in the audience, Val Levada, some people here may know him, is a serial entrepreneur in town. He gave me his card afterwards, and he said, "Hey, let's go grab a coffee." And so I had made a commitment about that time that I really wanted to do entrepreneurial things, but I didn't know anything really about business. And I had a lot of entrepreneurial mentors. And so what I decided to do was to meet people in the entrepreneurial ecosystem every 2 or 3 weeks. And I did that for years and years, and to form relationships. And so I would actually make, even though I was writing all these grants, I'd make a lot of time to meet people. And so I went and met with Val, and he said, I want to introduce you to Kathy Call at Skintifique. Kathy then introduced me to Sridhar Nitesan, who some people here probably know. And then Sridhar asked me to give some presentations. Anyhow, that ended up in a Skintifique grant, so several millions of dollars over multiple years. And then I got to meet people, actually 2 entrepreneurs that led to the formation of 2 different companies. So
that's an awesome story. I love that. Like, I heard it multiple times, but I get excited hearing it again, because I think it really touches upon this human network that is so important for you to build, especially when you're getting outside of your own comfort zone, right? So you built your career in academia, but then you got to actually step outside. And I'm sure you're still doing that, doing convergent science, having to meet other people in different countries. So I know we talked a little bit about your networking skill have changed over time, and how to meet people outside of your circle if you were in academia versus industry. And there's actually an audience question on academic entrepreneur who wants to find a co-founder. You know, how do you go about doing that? So if you're one of those hybrid, you have to find another hybrid. How do you go about doing that?
yeah, I think so I don't think there's ever a prescription for anything, just the way that I kind of look at it. But what I do feel is that there's a process for everything, and that process is evolving constantly, and over time, and you never stop evolving that process. And so, because what works for one person, could work for someone differently, or for that same person could change over time. Like something that was effective in the past doesn't work now, and so you need to figure out another strategy. So early on, what I would do is I would just attend tons of networking sessions and just try to push myself to talk to people. Even though, sometimes I kind of feel like sometimes I'm more extroverted, sometimes I'm more introverted, and I kind of bounce back and forth. But often at these events, I tend to be a little more introverted. So I just force myself to go up and ask people like questions and try to introduce myself, and that kind of a thing. And often it doesn't really lead anywhere, but just nice kind of conversation or chatting with people. But what I found over time is that as I was advancing my work, it became apparent what some of the key needs were of, like, we needed to understand the regulatory pathway of certain things we're doing, or whether something could be manufactured, or what the IP space was, or some of these kinds of things, reimbursement, that kind of stuff. So when I was at these events, I would specifically try to go meet with somebody, and then I would have a purpose in mind. So it wasn't necessarily just kind of, interacting with people, although I did a lot of that. It was a lot of it I found to be like the really effective parts was forming relationships with people. So it wasn't just like a one-time thing, but very kind of purpose driven. And so I went to, like, all the law firms have all these networking things. So I started to go to that. And like when invited speakers were in town from companies, I'd go and I try and ask the speaker a question, and then, go up afterwards and try to talk to them and stuff. So, and then I think, to specifically the question about co-founder, that type of thing. I mean, I think, again, it's one of these things. It's a process. So it's you kind of have, there's a cadence to it as well. So it's not just a process, but there's like a timing of how things work, a rhythm, And so I feel like a part of it is you want to meet lots of people, you want to float your ideas, you want to develop relationships, figure out like where there's good matches, where there's the synergies, where there's excitement, and like where there's momentum. And that's actually one of the words I really focus on a lot in almost everything I do, which is like, how can we build momentum? Who can we bring in next who could help us to get to the next stage, or, sort of fill a gap that we don't, knowledge gap or skill set, that, that kind of a thing. So to me, trying to find a founder, I would try to understand like what the specific need is for that person, but then also just start kind of floating the idea and look at it as a process, because it takes time, and you want to really take time to find the right match.
I think that's a really good point. Also, having a purpose in a networking meeting, I definitely, like me as an introvert, was a really good, it's like a point to hold on to. And I'm kind of curious, what kind of homework do you do before going into some of these, speaking engagements? If you actually have a purpose, how do you define it, and how do you figure out who to meet and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I think, a big part of this is that we don't know. Like I often go into things where I really have no idea, beforehand. But I think it's just like pushing and just trying, like testing things and just treating everything as an experiment. And so as we're advancing in a project, let's just say, for example, in the lab, and we're developing a material and we get an interesting result, we may say, okay, well, can this be manufactured? Because if we can't manufacture this at the large scale, so okay, can we find a chemical engineer or a manufacturing firm or something and just have an early conversation? Or it's, we're trying to advance a project in the lab and we're thinking about how can we get some really critical data? So we'll say, okay, well, if this was to advance, like how can we put this on track to have a commercial, opportunity for this to actually help patients? So we'll say, well, if we ran a clinical trial, what would the comparator be? And we want to include that as early as possible in our experiments, because what I realized is that often when we do experiments, it's really easy in science to kind of show what you're doing is like the bar is here and the negative control is down here. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have an important result. It only becomes an important result when you're actually doing better than the gold standard, or something like that, where there's like a function, an improvement. And so what we try to do is we try to ask, and I ask this question almost every lab meeting, which is, what's the bar that we need to exceed to get everybody excited? What's the best result that anyone has ever achieved in a particular model, and how much better do we need to do? And so to me, it's that kind of general thinking, like really thinking about what's our target, and then going into these kind of networking discussions with that target in mind, and sort of trying to put all the pieces around it that are essential, for things after they leave the lab to kind of get to patients.
Yeah, I think that actually segues really nice into some of the conversational thread I wanted to pull, which is about your lab. So you told me something about, we always try to set the bar really high, but be super, open-minded about it. And that was one of the philosophy that you hold to actually get to the translational science that you were talking about. So can you give us some examples on the real example that went on when you were selecting different projects, and how it kind of formed into a fully fledged project that went on and get commercialized?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, so every project starts completely differently, and there's I'd say almost, really not too many things that are linear. And so, because ideas are kind of just constantly flowing. We have, people come to us with problems, or we just, people in the lab come up with ideas, and so everything kind of, so for example, you mentioned Skintifique. That project actually started when I met Rox Anderson who's a dermatologist in town, is a leader over at the Wellman Institute at Mass General. And I sat beside him at dinner, and I was like, oh my God, just like, it's just so inspiring. I'd love to work with him. And so I went home that night and was just sort of trying to figure out, like, well, what could I do in dermatology to find a way to work with Rox? And I was like twisting my ring, and I realized I figured out I had a nickel allergy. My skin was red around my wedding ring. And I brought it to the lab, I tested it, I found there was nickel in it. And so then we developed, that's how Skintifique actually kind of started, like that sort of like thing. But, often, and there's so many different ways that projects have started in the lab. And there was a neonate adhesive that we were developing, because there was a group in town called the Institute for Pediatric Innovation, which is a nonprofit organization, and they had gone around to a lot of the pediatric intensive care units in the US and asked what's the biggest problem that you face. And one of the big problems was these tapes that affix tubes onto neonate skin. And when you take it off, it just tears the skin. And so we got funding through Philips that had a children's medical venture group, the light bulb company, to do that. And we were advancing and we were trying to synthesize a new material, and it just got too complicated, and it completely crashed and burned. And then someone in the lab, Brian Lawlick, said, okay, well, what if we do this not from a chemistry perspective, but we do this from like more of like a material science, like topography and looking, kind of a completely different approach. And we tried that, and it actually ended up working. And clearly there was like a lot of like disappointment in the project and frustration when things weren't working out, and we were like, is this going to die? And then but to me, that's like actually one of the key elements of that I think is just so important in problem solving and research and all these things, is that when you encounter failure, I almost feel like it's not like people always say, I always hear this, I used to say it too, like, it's an opportunity to learn, but I almost feel like that's not the way to look at it, because that's vague, right? Because learn what? Like, what are you trying to learn? Like, how is that useful? Just learning something, right? Like, you can go to, Encyclopedia Britannica or whatever, and you can learn stuff, but you're not necessarily, it may be interesting, you might satisfy your curiosity, but it may not actually serve a purpose. So I think, to me, I look at it as failure is an opportunity to evolve your strategy, to evolve your process for problem solving, because it creates this really high emotional state where you have frustration, you have these things, but you're motivated now even more than ever. Like you're more like, brought into this whole process where now you really are fighting for it. You know what I mean? You didn't have that necessarily before, but when you fail, it kind of just everything comes out. And to me, that's when you dig deeper. That's when there's an opportunity to be creative, when you start engaging other people, and that process sticks with you the next problem you go to solve. So to me, that's like what's really important about encountering failure and, this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. So I'm sure you talk a lot about a little bit about creativity and involving other people for different ideas. You created amazingly interesting lab composition, people from all over different world working on different projects. I want to talk a little bit about your mentoring style that have evolved since you started the lab. So tell us a little bit about the iteration process there.
Okay, yeah. So again, that has totally been a process. I feel like, I had no idea what I was doing in the beginning. But I really wanted to try to figure it out. So actually, when I was a grad student, I was mentoring like a PhD student. I actually ended up mentoring a master's student and other students, and just try to figure it, because there's a lot of so many aspects of trying to mentor, because to me, one of the biggest is that you want to see people's potential. When you look at them, you want to like sort of treat them as if that not where they're at, but where they could be, like where they're going, like that kind of a thing. So how do you sort of figure that out, and try to really get a sense for like what people's potential is, and what they're capable of, and then how do you extract that, and to me, it just took like a lot of just mentoring, like just trying to figure out, and trying to, one of the things I struggled actually a lot with was, how hands-on do I be? Do I micromanage? Do I step back? How much freedom do I give people? Like I really struggled a lot with that, and eventually kind of realized that one of the best ways for me at least, was to not micromanage as a core strategy, but to just populate my lab with people with completely different disciplines. So they're coming in with, minimize the overlap of expertise, and then have the people in the lab make the decision of who's coming to the lab, because they'll never pick someone who's competitive. They'll actually look for people who are going to elevate their science, be able to do things that they're not doing right now. And so so that's kind of, and they can veto me. I kind of put that in as well. Like if people in the lab say, we should hire this person. And I'm like, I'm not sure. Then we do what they say kind of thing. So I feel like that's really been important. And the way I kind of look at it is that, it's like we're sitting around a table brainstorming, and everyone can provide unique perspective. Everyone has something to offer that no one else can, because there's minimal overlap of expertise. So then everybody feels validated. And so I've kind of, been learning about that too. Like, just how do you make people like take ownership of projects and just feel like it's theirs. And another big part of it, I feel, is empowerment. So, when early on, I was trying to control everything and, trying to figure that out. But I realized that one of the ways that you can really unlock people's potential, which then leads to, kind of, you can do incredible things. Like if you can start to create an environment to do that, so have like people in the lab leading collaborations, and when I'm asked to give a talk, like kind of, getting some people in the lab to give those talk, like just, kind of doing that kind of thing. So I feel a big part of mentorship has been taking care of people. Anyone who comes to my lab, I commit to being a mentor for life. And I learned that from, other mentors, is trying to study and learn from other people that, like Bob Langer, for example, my PhD advisors, for example. But yeah, all of these things has just been really important. And again, it's this evolving process. Everybody's different. Everyone has different sort of directions they're headed.
Yeah, it's great. Great perspective. By the way, I'm going to be taking a Q&A, and you can just put it on the chat, and I'll just either incorporate it or after my questions are done, I'll just start adding on. But I wanted to kind of turn a gear a bit and talk about the future. So I know there's a lot of exciting new development in your place. I want to learn more about what your recent failures are, then you're trying to iterate right now, what kind of mentors you are seeking, like whatever you're currently developing.
Yeah. So what are we currently doing? I always have to kind of step back and think about it, because sometimes I feel, I'm just so in, kind of doing all these things. It's like when I'm asked these questions, I was like, well, wait a moment. It's like sometimes when people ask me like how old I am, I'm like, am I 45 or 46? Like I have to like think about it. Yeah, I mean, I'd say we developed a needle that can automatically stop in between the different layers of the eye to then deliver drugs to the back of the eye. And we've been exploring using that for gene therapy. We published a paper on it a couple of years back, but there's a lot of momentum now in that area, because one of the big problems is how do you get drugs, and in particular gene therapy, to the back of the eye? And if you just inject it into the eye, into the vitreous, it can't diffuse well enough. Most agents can't get to the back of the eye in high enough concentration. And then there's these really kind of complicated surgical procedures that some centers can do, but most can't. So we developed a needle that can, and this was a project that actually began. I mean, this was one that was like iteration after iteration. It started with a conversation back in Bob Langer's lab with Omid Farakozad, who's an anesthesiologist at the Brigham. And he was talking in this conference room. I'll never forget. It was probably around like 2006 or so. And he was talking about epidural anesthesia and how sometimes when, him and his colleagues are doing it, you go too far and you puncture the dura and there's cerebral spinal fluid leak. And so ended up being like, I was in the room with him probably like 2 hours. Everyone had left and we were just chatting about it. And, I'd never done anything with needles before. So I found Alex Slocum at MIT, who develops a lot of probes and different things. And we applied for funding. We got funding. We developed this needle that could automatically stop in the context of epidural anesthesia, published a paper. Then we developed another needle that can access the abdomen. Like, so it was kind of one of these things. And then the third generation of the needle was this needle that could access different layers of the eye. And we just had really good timing on it. And the previous needles, I think, are really interesting, but not necessarily things that would make a huge difference in medicine. But I think our third generation actually has a lot of potential. So that's just one of the things that we're working on. But there's a lot of other things as well.
Okay. So it looks like in order for you to, set that translational bar, you would have to have a lot of interaction with industry, patient population, and just trying to get at what's that next bar you have to meet, right? So if it is a venture, it's a lot of customer discovery. I want to learn a little bit about how you do that in academic setting and what kind of collaborators you actually bring into the lab.
Yeah, we quickly hit, the extent of our knowledge very frequently. And so, but to me, it's like that's when you need to bring somebody else in.
Mhm.
And so, I really try to push to get there often. Um, I'd say that, and by the way, asking these questions in my lab meeting, what's the best result anyone's ever achieved, or what's the bar we need to exceed? Like, these are really hard questions to answer.
Mhm.
And so, but I would say I would kind of go back to what I was saying a little bit before about, you know, I've developed relationships with people in the community, like manufacturing experts, reimbursement regulatory experts, corporate lawyers, patent lawyers, people who understand, like investors and entrepreneurs. And so it's almost like there's this informal advisory board in my lab.
Mhm.
And so as we're advancing projects, I'm constantly reaching out to people that I know and have relationships with, and just asking them, hey, do you think this could be manufactured? Or what would the clinical trial look like that kind of stuff. So that we ask those questions a lot. And then sometimes the people that we ask those questions to, when we start the company, they end up getting involved in the company. So it's
Mhm.
and I think that's also one of the reasons that they like to kind of be involved, is because then there's these opportunities that can emerge. And one other thing I'll say about this is that um, one of the hardest things I think that we do, at least in terms of starting companies, is finding an entrepreneur um, who can actually lead the company. And to me, an entrepreneur, needs to be able to not just, kind of build the team and things, but raise money. That's like, so important, because we have so many ideas and so many things to do. And, we want to, and that's, that's always, I'd like to say it's gotten easier, but I don't think it has actually. So it's, been raising money is always challenging. In fact, one of my colleagues who started two companies, and they both became billion-dollar companies, for his like third company, he told me he got rejected like 25 times before he got funding, for the next one.
Yeah.
So to me, it's just so important to, and so getting back to kind of the model I've been trying to advance, which is develop relationships with people in the community, frequently interacting with them, and then um, when you go to start a company, then often there's people who could potentially be the CEO of the company that are already, and it's not just in your network, but you have relationships with. And so that's
Mhm.
how that's been really important, I think, to trying to move some of the technologies out of the lab.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Vineet was just talking about it on the chat. This relationship between academic entrepreneur and actually an entrepreneurial champion who can be the CEO and form the company, come up with a business plan. I think that's really important. And it's actually interesting to hear from you, after all this company that you have created, that that's still the most difficult part, and you have to constantly expand your network to do so. So that's really interesting. Tell us a little bit about that process of, so there's a lot of resources out there creating company. In Boston area, I almost feel like there's too many advices and I don't know which one to follow. So give us some advice on, pointing to the right direction on the people who wants to follow your footstep in that regard.
Yeah, so I'd say, well, one of the challenging things is to know when to start the company. And I've been trying to figure that out for a long time. And Bob Langer, when I have conversations with him, he says to me, and I know he says this to others too, is that you want to de-risk it. You want to take it as far as you possibly can because as soon as you take investor money, the clock is really ticking. In academia, it's a very safe environment, and you think things can kind of go at a slower pace, but you can use that as an opportunity to be more rigorous and to really so I think that's been so we try to take things as far as we can, and also in terms of putting stories together, really looking at our work as a story, and how can we tell the best possible story, and one where the impact is really evident. And this is something I've realized, like submitting papers, like we try to submit to high impact journals, like the high impact factor journals, and we've had a ton of rejections there, but they ask, like they look for very specific things about impact, and I've been trying to laser focus in on how did they ask, like how do they perceive impact, and how did the reviewers perceive impact, because the better we understand that, the better we can put our stories together to then tell, and the more receptive audiences will have, whether that's investors or and so to me, that's where some of these questions really come in, like what's the best result anyone has ever achieved. If you can put up a graph and show that in the exact same model, you're getting a result of here, but the best result anyone else has achieved is down here. So it sounds like, I don't know, when I think about it, it just sounds simple, but it's so hard to do that. And to me, that is one of the biggest things that's missing. Like, let's say if colleagues of mine send like investor decks, and even when we're trying to put it together, it's a thing that's really hard to do, but it's I think one of the most important things is how do you tell the story of impact of what you're doing? Why is what you're doing so much better than what everything else is out there? And how can you put it in like data driven format? And then I think once you can get there, then a lot of doors will start opening up.
Great. So there are some questions from the audience. There are 3 of them. So the first one's from Raimundo. Talk more about the role of CEO and CFO. How do you see your role apart from these key functions?
Yeah, so I see my role as like, I never take an operational role in any of the companies. I really see my role as a science advisor. Some people may say like, maybe I'll be on the scientific advisory board, or maybe I'll be like the instead of like, like CEO, it's kind of like the chief science advisor or something like that, all these interesting titles. But I never take an operational role. And I think that, I see it more as like, I want to make sure that what we do in the lab can be transferred into the company, and that the technology will work in the company. And sometimes it doesn't work as expected. Like sometimes actually, we're making stuff at like 10-gram scale in the lab, and the company needs to make it at like 100 or kilogram kind of scale or whatever it is, and they need it to be shelf stable. And we don't do shelf stable because we just use it and make it right away, and then we start the company and put it in there. It doesn't work, and then we have to figure out. I mean, that's happened before as well. But I think for CEO, CFO, yeah, I mean, often what happens is the CFO doesn't come in until a little bit later, and the CEO, that is more like the founding entrepreneur, sort of serves multiple roles, and then ideally they have deep network and relationships, and they can start to bring in their colleagues, and then they might bring in a CFO who's like 1 day a week, or just to start.
Yeah, well, Ronan also had a question. I think it's related to what you just said, but how to get help from financial management or business management, and how to write your first business plan, which is very different than coming up with the scientific, the proposals. So, any advice on that?
Well, I would say find somebody who can help actually do that, and so. And one of the ways I think to do that is regardless of where you are, most institutions have a business school, and I think sort of partnering even with like MBA students, because often MBA students have actually been out working in real jobs before, and then go to MBA. So I think to me the MBA students often are very hungry to be involved in these types of things, because it gives them experience, and this thing could really take off. And so there's a lot of momentum there, bringing in, so partnering with a potential MBA student to do it, or if you can find, entrepreneur in the community to help do that. Sometimes you don't have access right away, and so you might just draft what you think is what it should look like, and then you start going around to people and having people review it, so that you can then start to get, and I always look, I would not always look, but I try to look at things where it's like the advice that I'm being given is not, that's not the end sort of goal, it's part of the process. So like, as the advice is given, I'm trying to think about, okay, like thinking, how do I lock that into my mind? And so sometimes I'll have like an Evernote note thing that I'm have going, and when I'm getting advice, I'm making notes as well, because I want to be able to search it later for the next time, that kind of a thing. But a lot of it is just kind of getting out there and just having lots of conversations and getting stuff on paper and sending it to people, and having them like totally trash it sometimes, but then trying to look at like, well, why did they ask that? Like, why were they so concerned about that? Like, just kind of trying to use it as a learning opportunity.
Okay. So you have 3 minutes left, and there's a couple more questions. I think the interesting thing one here is, when do you know how to stop iterating, right? So when do you just give up? You talk about your needle was a third generation. I mean, research goals and business goals really different, right? So there's a boundary between those two.
Yeah. Well, I think that the answer to that question may be different in academia versus in a company, because a lot more pressures in a company when the clock is ticking, and you're using investors' money to move things forward. Whereas in academia, you can potentially always apply for another grant, and kind of keep things kind of moving on. But I think that and it's not an easy question to answer, but some things I can say that, like one thing is, often I found that if you hit a dead end, it's because there is some, like, for example, there's something about the biology that's missing, that it's not defined enough, like we need a basic biology discovery to be able to move to something next. And so it's really trying to clue into, what if something's not working, and we've been iterating and trying to come at it from different angles, what is it that we're missing? Like, what is that piece? Like, what experiments could we conduct that have nothing to do with technology, that are purely based on basic science and exploration? And so we try to define that, and then in the academic setting, we might be able to go ahead and try and do those experiments. In companies, depending on, like, the burn rate and how much money you have, and how important this is, you might just sort of shelf it, or you might try and dig in and try to figure it out more, from explore. And often I find in companies that that are well funded, they're not just advancing the technology, but they're actually advancing basic exploration as well, because the better you understand the mechanism, and understand what's the extent of biology that's known, can help you gauge the riskiness of assumptions that you're making, and things like that.
Yeah, I think this comes back to your point of knowing when to start the company and de-risking as much as you can about finding all those missing pieces of biology. So the last two questions, Moretza and Daniel, both are wondering about the CEO and founder. So technical PhD. So instead of staying in academia like you, there are some people who wants to actually get out of academia and start the company. So what's your thought on the PhD CEOs? Some of the VC actually expect a lot of these people to be working full time, so not double dipping on two different endeavor, but actually honing in on one position. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I don't think there's any single kind of rule in all of this. I think that the often investors bet on the technology, but they're also betting on the people. And I think when they bet on people, they're not betting that the people who are in the company aren't going to fail. In fact, they know they're going to fail. They know they're going to encounter challenges. They're betting on the people because they know when they encounter failures or challenges, that they can be resourceful, and they can make lemonade out of lemons, you know, like that kind of a thing, right? So I think that's kind of that's why they're betting on the people, right? And so to me, it doesn't matter as much about whether, you know, it's someone who's super young or inexperienced or PhD or not. You know, it's like more about, you know, and some people are ready and some people are not ready. You know, like some people would be better off being in a company and learning from a CEO, and then for their next gig, then being the CEO. You know, like it's just a matter. So I think trying to tune into that, because at the end of the day, starting companies and you know, working in startups and moving things forward is really, really hard. Like it's like there's so many challenges and so many, and you have to be open. Like you have to be willing to work evenings and weekends and take calls at weird hours, and you know, like just be able, like, you know, like it's hard to set boundaries when you're doing startups, and that I think is one of the greatest challenges. And you know, at the same time, it's important. You're just coming kind of hopefully out of COVID, at least, you know, here, and spending time with family is so more important than ever, right? Like we're not having like dinner with our families like we used to and all this kind of stuff. So I think it's just really challenging to do startups because you're kind of, you know, your attention is going between a lot of different things, but I think that you know, it's important to I think reflect on, you know, to reflect on what, you know, if you're young and let's say you have a PhD and you want to be an entrepreneur, you know, like, you know, I just have to reflect on, maybe it's good to try to see how it goes, and then if it doesn't, maybe take a position that's a bit lower than the CEO and something, and then, you know, and then do it as your next thing, like, you know, kind of thinking about things. One thing I will say on that, just like one last thing, I guess, is a tool that I've been playing around with a lot, and I mentioned before about cadence, but I try to think about the moment after, right? So I'm always thinking about, like, for example, when I get my vaccine, I don't like to get needles, right? So I'm thinking, oh my God, like, and then so I'm thinking like, okay, but like 5 minutes after, 10 minutes after, I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be alive, you know, like I'm always thinking about what that after thing. And so I try to do that as well in the companies and when things are not going well. And, you know, because there's a lot of challenges, a lot of things that come up. So I'm always trying to think about, okay, you know, like think back to moments when things didn't go well, and then you turn them around and then project that forward, you know, as well.
That's great. Thank you, Jeff. So this is, it was great. All the inspirational stories, your personal stories, and intercalating all the questions and answers. So thank you so much. Thanks for the audience. So you can register for the next Hub Cures. Jenna just uploaded a link to it. And also the networking table will be open after this stage is over. So you're not automatically put into the table. So you actually have to go to, I think the link is right here, the tab networking tables. I know it's kind of weird to sit in a table of 10 with strangers, but it's really fun. There's people from Connecticut and New Jersey today, as well as in Massachusetts. So go ahead and network. Like Jeff said, you got to meet people from outside of your circle. So thank you so much. And we'll see you in next Hub Cures.
All right. Thank you. This was great.
And I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of all of us, Jeff and Jenny.
All right.
Very good, you know, learnings and a lot of inspiration and just great advice. So thank you so much. And folks, yes, join us for networking, but also join us for MLSC and the next Hub Cures, of course. See you soon.